us to arm those who are fighting for freedom. And in some cases at that time, it was in our own hemisphere in Central America against Soviet aggression. Today, it's actually the Democrats that have been most stalwart in wanting to stand up against Putin's aggression. And the Republican nominee has advocated and actually praised Putin and said we shouldn't be involved in supporting Ukraine. When I was roughly y'all's age, and I was growing up and believing in conservative policies, economically, we believed in free trade. That was sort of a first principle that free markets and free trade lift all boats, and it's good not just economically, but it's good internationally as far as what your relations are. If you're trading with other nations, you're less likely to have conflict. And yet, what our party put forward at the convention this year was basically not just Trump's position, but in the party platform, it advocates for tariffs across the whole globe. And while I think that's been part of President Trump's rhetoric before, I think in our administration it was fairly targeted in to try to get concessions from China. Not to say we're going to put a 10% tariff across the globe, which would be the biggest, in my mind, tax increase since Smoot-Hawley. And so I think that there has been significant shifts ideologically, and I think that it's caused, in many cases, the Democrat Party to have a similar response to that takes an opposite position from where they traditionally were. And so I think there's been several issues, those are three off the top of my head, but I think there's been several issues where the parties have totally flip-flopped on their positions.
But is that flip-flop dynamic normal? Again, thinking in a broad view, bringing up previous periods of American history, the electoral coalitions are always shifting. African American voters, through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, were steadfast in the party of Lincoln, the Republican Party. That's no longer true. Barack Obama won a majority of non-college educated voters in 2008. And the last I heard was Harris was under 25 points. So there's always this sort of dynamism to how the electoral coalitions are shifting. Isn't there?
Of course there is, and I know you're asking that question provocatively, but I think that you're right. The parties do change, but I think that it's been unprecedented to see it happen this rapidly on so many core issues of what I believe conservatives and Republicans believed. And so I do believe it's been more transformative in a very short period of time. It's been surrounding more of a personality than a core set of issues. And geographically it's happened. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that we considered, that even when George Bush was elected, you said, hey, this is now a new coalition of states that never is going to leave us. And there's been a lot of states that have left the Republican Party and gone Democrat and vice versa. And so I think sometimes, pundits want to say things are static when you're right, they're not. But there's a difference between, I would say, the party of Lincoln breaking slavery and African Americans being part of the Republican Party for 60, 70 years, and then shifting the civil rights era to the Democrat Party versus a set of issues from economic policy, candidly social policy, foreign policy, all seeing a flip in a matter of a couple of years. And frankly, I think that the administration I served in was pretty consistently conservative as far as what the policies were. I have no conviction that that's what a second Trump administration would look like in any way. And that's a very quick time period in which you've had that sort of transformation.
So if I thank you for that. If I understand some of the argument you're putting forward, much of this feels perhaps particularly toxic and destabilizing because of the role of personalities. Is that fair?
Yeah, I don't even know that I'm simply even offering it as toxic. I'm simply saying it's to be observed. The reality is that there's been a big transformation in the Republican Party, and I think as a response, there's been an equal shift in the Democrat Party in the issues.
So that actually was my question. Do you think both parties are driven by the politics of personality or susceptible to that personality?
Yeah, for sure. But I think that Trump is such a different personality that I think it's been exacerbated in the last few years.
Well, give me an example. I have my biases, but I feel like
I think I gave you a couple. One was foreign policy. I mean, in the 1980s, the Democrat Party was opposed to every bit of Reagan's support of the Contras in Nicaragua. And yet today, they're the ones that are taking the lead in providing support for those trying to establish freedom in Ukraine from Russian aggression. On immigration, it was the labor unions that were the ones who were fighting to make sure there was no migrant labor competition. And yet today, let's say it's the Democrats that are more open to having more migrant workers inside our borders. I don't think that's a revelation to anybody. But so, yeah, I think that there's been several issues in which the Democrat Party perhaps as a response also shifted.
Would you say then that's altered your perception of the ongoing definition of conservatism? Is conservatism for you then the set of values that undergird these policies, or the policies themselves?
I'd like to believe that conservatism has not shifted. I think our party has shifted. But I believe that conservatism is, in my mind, founded in a limited government principle, that our rights are endowed by our Creator, that they're not given to us by government. If they're given to you by government, they can be taken away by government. They're endowed by your Creator, and the government is there to protect those rights and to have as small and limited a role as possible. That's principle my foundation to limited government conservatism. And I don't think that that's where, frankly, the majority of Republicans are today. And I'd say, another example of that is that on the one hand, Republicans, I think, have a valid argument about lawfare and believing that the Department of Justice is politicized and targeting Trump in some of these prosecutions. But on the other hand, Donald Trump himself has said, if I'm elected, I'm going to go target my political enemies. That's not limited government conservatism in any form or fashion, to say, I'm going to use the power and levers of government to go after my political opponents. And so I think that conservatism, I'd like to believe, is still the principles I believe in. But I do believe that our Republican Party has been is more supportive of the personality today and is not as intellectually grounded.
Perfect. So I guess we have just been talking about conservative and what it means. My senior year of high school, protesters breached the United States Capitol building on January 6th. I was in class surrounded by about 20 people. Many of my classmates who would self-style themselves both as Trump supporters and as conservatives were actively cheering on the taking of the building. In your piece in the Portland Press Herald earlier this week, you remarked, I think foundationally as a conservative, you have to believe in the rule of law over the rule of man. How then do you reconcile your belief in the fact that conservatism is about values and about the rule of law with the fact that many young Republicans who also identify as conservatives and with the conservative movement do not necessarily share those values? What then does this mean for the future of both conservatism and the Republican Party for these two definitions to be maybe diverging?
There's a lot in that question. I would tell you what I believe conservatism is. I think there's others who claim that they're conservatives as well. I share with you what my philosophical foundation is. I certainly agree, I think, with the premise of your question. Having been one of the people who was evacuated on January 6th by Secret Service and witnessed that tragic day up close, I don't believe those people were rioting were conservatives.
Yeah, it goes into the
I believe that there were a lot of people who got caught up in some
here
of
because that's how we get to 8.
I think there were also some very malevolent actors in that crowd as well. I do not consider those people conservative because in what you stated, I think as conservatives, we have to believe in the rule of law because candidly, folks, we may love each other, but we don't trust man when he has power, man or woman, in positions of significant power. That's why you need the government that's governed by laws. That's what our founders knew so wisely, and the system they created has existed so well. And so if we instead decide we're going to throw out the law because we're supportive of one individual, I think that's what we fought a revolution against. And so, so when people take on that notion that somehow the rioters in January 6th were somehow they had cause for those actions, I take great umbrage to that because My position, quite frankly, and perhaps this is provocative for some of you in the room, is I say, as conservatives, many of us took great concern about the BLM riots in the fall of 2020. And we took a position that those who, can protest in free speech is one thing. To burn down and destroy businesses is another. And they should be prosecuted at full extent of the law. But if you have a position, how can you say that those who perpetrated January 6th somehow shouldn't be prosecuted at full extent of the law? I think you have to be consistent.
I'm actually in broad agreement with you that personalization of our politics, right? Viewing politics through the prism of this guy's for me, those people are for me, this guy's against me, makes it easier to excuse, not reflect on one's own self-contradictions. I've studied this, and I don't know if I have a great answer, so it's a little bit of an unfair question. Do you have a sense of how we got to this moment?
I remember in 2016, and I view this as a positive for Donald Trump, frankly. But I joined the campaign in 2016 when Pence was tapped to be vice president. I had served Mike on Capitol Hill. But when I joined the campaign, I came in as a skeptic. I didn't think that there was a pathway. I viewed that the Clinton machine was still pretty dominant and strong. You have to remember that in the summer of 2016, at our own convention in August, the person who finished second, Ted Cruz, got up to give a speech and refused to endorse Trump. Our party was completely split and broken. And so thinking that 3 months later you'd be winning the presidency, I was committed to the campaign, but I had my doubts. Mm-hmm. But I remember the first time that I began to see something different, it was Labor Day weekend of 2016. It was the first time that Trump and Pence ended up campaigning at the same place. And it was a Labor Day party, rally, picnic in Eastern Ohio, small town of maybe 10,000. And there were 15, 20,000 people there coming out of the woodworks. And to answer your question, I think that for so many people, Trump was the symbol to say, I'm so fed up with Washington. I'm so fed up that they don't represent me anymore. And he's going to represent me. He's going to fight my battles. And I think that he tapped into that in some ways in a populist appeal, in a way that I think propelled the campaign to victories, particularly in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, that enabled him to win. And I think that how we got there is that I think that a lot of Americans felt that the government no longer represented them. And they wanted an outsider who was going to go turn the tables upside down. And they got that. They got that for sure. And they got a lot of chaos with it. But I would argue that the policies of the administration were built on a foundation of traditional conservatism, tax relief, what we actually did on a foreign policy front, the social policies, the confirmation of judges, the rebuilding of military. And so those policies were there, but I think where we've gone as a party today is embracing far more of the populism and far less of the conservatism.
Yeah. So I guess the natural follow-up to that is what happens now? Is it possible for the Republican Party in its current form to move past the one-man-centered populism of the Trump years without necessarily discarding those ideas, or does this call for an ideological overhaul that may mark a shift back to what you define as traditional conservatism?
I think that if Democrats win this November, it'll be natural that our party has that internal fight that I think we need to have about the future direction of what the positions are we're going to stand for. But I also think that even though he was able to tap into that populist appeal, as I say, I think that there are a lot of Republicans who misinterpreted what that was. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of Republicans today who have said Trump is right on trade policy or have embraced higher minimum wage policies that they traditionally opposed, or have embraced, as frankly J.D. Vance has proposed, significant growth of the regulatory state through legislation. He singled out for praise someone you may not know, but a lady who runs the Federal Trade Commission named Lena Khan, who's done more to stop transactions, business transactions in our economy than anybody else. And you may agree with her, but that's not a traditional Republican position. And I think they interpret it as that's the key to winning those Midwest states. And for me, I never once in any of the rallies that I attended in those Midwest states with Trump and Pence had anyone come up and say, thank God Donald Trump's going to raise the minimum wage. Or, you know what, I really want us to have more protectionist trade policy. I think it's been a misinterpretation of our party to say that's how you win over the blue collar, middle class voter in the Midwest. And I think that for most of them, back to your earlier questioning, for most of them, it was a cultural battle. It was a cultural thing that they identified with Trump, not of an economic policy. And I think there are many in our party who have misinterpreted the lesson of the 2016 election.
No, that's really interesting. But can you really have I'm speaking to the people that feel dispossessed and out of power, and then turn around and say, yeah, but we're just going to double down on the Washington free trade consensus once you elect us again? Like, I get that people aren't always watching policy as closely as we are, but doesn't policy sort of have to follow the anti-establishment rhetorical line a little bit?
I think that there's many conservatives who are anti-establishment, Nick. I think that, there was a merging of something that I think has been castigated today in a negative light that I don't view negatively, and that was the Tea Party movement. The Tea Party movement really was born, as I witnessed it, out of revolt to the Wall Street bailouts and believing that why are we taking dollars from middle America and giving them to wealthy bankers in New York? That less government intervention in our economy is a conservative position that happens to, I think, combine with where we are from a populist position. So I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think there's plenty of places where if you want actually a more limited government, a more free economy, that those messages actually are cohesive.
We've thrown out just a few things for you to consider. If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. I think Allison already has somebody lined up.
And would you mind just telling me your name and where you're from?
Yeah.
I'd love that.
Oh, sounds good. Hi. Oh. No. Hi, I'm Aubrey. I'm from Rhode Island, but I'm a military brat, so I was actually born in Maine, and I'm a government major and a sophomore. So I also read the interview you did for the Portland Press Herald a couple days ago, in which you say you hope to, quote, inspire people with integrity to enter into a career of public service. In a world that rewards politicians with extreme views and, as you've said, strong personalities with headlines and viral memes, my question is, how do you suggest that we shift the current political culture to reward character and not simply charisma or personality?
Aubrey, thanks for that question. It's a great question. I think I empathize with the position you have, and I bemoan to a lot of my friends that we've created in Washington a sort of performative artist nature in our elected officials, and it's sort of incented by how many YouTube hits can I get, and how many different social media likes can I get, and I don't think it attracts the best and brightest of what we have to offer to serve our country. I think I don't have a better solution for you, Aubrey, than to believing that we need to inspire people that are y'all's age to understand there's something noble about being able to serve in whatever capacity that is. And public service is a great one. Whether you're left or right, we need people of higher character serving our country. And I say that from somebody, as I mentioned, y'all know my association with Mike Pence. People say we need more bipartisanship today. And I don't know that I agree that we need more bipartisan legislation. I think we need a different tone. What I mean by that is Mike Pence probably didn't agree with John Lewis on anything, any vote they ever had. When John Lewis was going to mark the 35th anniversary of the assault on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, he asked Mike Pence to be the leader of Republicans to come to that. They were personal friends. There's a guy named John Berman, who was Howard Berman, sorry, congressman from California. He and Mike Pence started the anti-Semitic caucus in the Congress. They didn't agree on most issues. You'd probably find a hard time finding actually issues they would vote the same way. But they personally were friends and could get along. And I think what we've created in Washington is it used to be that people of different parties could still be friends. And today we're much more tribal in our own camps. And I think that I think some of this actually started with bringing cameras into the House and Senate floor, because now you're performing for a different audience. On the one hand, Americans should have transparency. So I don't want to argue that you should take those cameras out. I'm just making the point that I think that began the notion of members performing for an audience as opposed to looking to legislate for their districts. But the best way, I think, to solve that is actually to try to inspire people of strong character that there's value in being able to serve in those jobs. And right now, I think the incentive structure is driven to discourage people of strong character and success from being a part of that.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah. Aubrey, my oldest son just graduated officer candidate school in Newport. Is that where you were, Newport, Rhode Island?
So I'm from like the Southeastern area.
Okay.
I spent a lot of time in Newport, but
Okay.
camped up there for a while. Absolutely.
Yeah, it is. Thanks.
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. My name is Dev Purohit. I'm a senior, I'm a government major, and I'm from Queens, New York.
Great.
My question is about the recent Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. Since then, 7 states, Vermont, Montana, Michigan, Kentucky, Kansas, California, and Ohio, have put the question of abortion directly on the ballot. And in all 7 of those instances, voters rejected proposals to limit abortion. I read a recent Portland Press Herald article from you where you expressed concern that the Republican Party has softened their stance on abortion. So my question is, why should conservatives continue to support a stance that American voters are seemingly overwhelmingly rejecting at the ballot box?
I had no idea some people read the Portland newspaper. Yeah, it's great. I am pro-life. I believe from, I think, earlier question you asked, that, and I know that's probably an unpopular position on most college campuses, but I believe that consistent with a limited role of government, the job of government is to protect the most innocent. And I believe life begins at conception. We can disagree on that, but if you believe what I believe, then that's a consistent view that you want to advocate for, because you believe you're helping to save lives. It may not be politically popular, but I think that what our party lacks today is actually somebody who could be a champion for life and articulate to the American people why he or she is pro-life. There's no doubt that we've been on the losing end of multiple referendum in the last couple of years. And I think that after Roe v. Wade was decided, for 50 years, our side was activated to overturn it. I think that politically, it's going to be, I think, somewhat expected with the Dobbs decision that the pro-choice side is going to be more activated to want to overturn that decision right now. And so it's not surprising really to me that there's more energy on that side for those referendum. But I believe that we right now lack a leader who can articulate why he believes in the value of life. And I think that, frankly, Donald Trump's position of states' rights is the same position of Stephen Douglas on slavery. And I think that if you look at his position and you extend it to say, he says, I'm for chemical abortions, and I'm for states, California, New York, Illinois, making their decisions, then the number of actual pregnancies you're protecting is a really small number, because about 2/3 of abortions today are chemical abortions. And probably of the remaining third, 2/3 are in the most populated states in New York, California, Illinois, et cetera, that are Democrat states. And so we don't have somebody who's actually making a case about why we believe in the value of life and why we're concerned about a culture that I think encourages abortion. And I think that, we've also failed to articulate what limitations right now would the Democrat Party accept or embrace on abortion. It's hard for me to see where they've actually advocated a position that says, you know what, here's a 15-week minimum. The 15-week minimum that's described in press as a national abortion ban, that is the child capable pain bill, because that's when doctors have determined that children can feel the pain of abortion. Socialist countries in Europe, who we view as far left, traditionally have minimums of 12 or 13 weeks. Yet to suggest that we should have a 15-week minimum somehow today seems out of the mainstream. And I think that we have failed to articulate a case for why we care. And I think often our party is too judgmental in this as well. We don't show enough care for unwanted pregnancies. We don't show enough support for women in those positions, with still being convicted of why we believe life begins at the earliest stages. And so that's a lot to throw at you, but I think it's not surprising entirely that we've lost those referendum. At the same time that those referendum on the ballot, governors who put forward 6-week or 12-week limits in Georgia, Florida, Ohio won by massive margins. And so I'm not as convinced as well that necessarily life is a losing issue politically. I think it's the right issue morally for our party to stand on. But I'm not yet convinced that if we make the case compassionately, which we often fail to do, that we can't also make it a winning political issue.
Will you stand?
Oh yeah, of course. Yep. Thank you. My name is Benjamin. I'm from South Korea. Just like Aubrey, I was not a military brat, but I was briefly a cadet at West Point, and I came to Kobe. My question is about, you mentioned the cultural battle that you saw in the 2016 election. And I know, since I'm working with Angus King and I'm also part of the Kobe Dems, and I know that Maine and Nebraska have a different electoral college allocation system. So my question is, do you think that moving forward, maybe departing from the electoral college system or altering it to a certain degree would better bring back the character that you've mentioned that we so lack in the government right now?
I don't know that I see the confluence there, Benjamin. I support the Electoral College. I think that we wanted to have representation from smaller states. And I think that there's often an argument that says, we should just elect presidents based on the popular vote. I think that our founders didn't want direct democracy for lots of reasons. And I think they wouldn't want smaller states to be overrun. But I'd also offer a couple points on it. One is that when you look at that number, typically, I think margins are often run up in California, New York. And I think there's a strong argument to say National Republican can't even campaign there because they know they can't win. And so when you're running up those margins in those couple of states, I think it skews the notion that the popular vote is much different than the Electoral College would be. And as we already discussed with one of Nick's earlier questions, I think these things change. It was again, not too long ago that Ohio was always going to be a battleground state. And now people say it's reliably Republican. It wasn't that long ago that Virginia was always a Republican presidential state. And now it's entirely a blue state. And so these things change. And so I believe in the Electoral College. I'm not convinced necessarily if you were to change that and make this direct democracy that would lead to different sorts of people representing us. Again, I go back to saying I think we have a poor incentive structure right now that incentivizes people to be more performance artists than actually serious legislators in Washington.
Yeah. So let me open it up a minute, because you've acknowledged that there are parts of our system that are broken, that create poor incentives. You acknowledge that maybe there's a reason why some people do feel not heard and drawn to candidates willing to blow up the system. I don't think there's an easy fix, but one, is anybody actually working on changing those incentives? And two, if you could find the time, and all you do, to work to change those incentives, where would you start?
Well, I think I conceded to Aubrey's question. I wish I had the answer better for that. I think I'd start here. I think you have to start in education, honestly. I think our educational system has to be able to convey why our founders established the system that they did and why we're so different than the rest of the globe and why it's important to be involved and be a part of it. I think it has to start at the educational front, Nick, but I don't have a solution that says, hey, turn off the televisions, turn off C-SPAN, from covering the House and Senate floor. I think there's other cost benefit to that.
Pay political science professors more.
How about on the other side of the room?
Anyone from up here want to ask a question? Hi, my name's Anna. I'm a sophomore. Yeah, I can stand up. I'm a sophomore from Massachusetts. And you mentioned earlier your desire to listen to the laws of your creator rather than having a stronger government control as part of your beliefs as to what it means to be conservative. What would you say to people who worry about the impact religious beliefs might have on future policies in a country that's supposed to have a separation of church and state?
Thanks for the question, Anna. I think that what our founders advocated was freedom of religion more than freedom from religion. And I think that many of our founders were very devout in their faith. And I think that there is a place in public service for people who are motivated by their faith. That doesn't have to be one faith. That can be many faiths. But I think too often we try to strive and say, we don't want any conversation about that. And I sort of feel like, we're always, I shouldn't say always. I think often in today's society, we're looking for so many safe spaces to avoid people being offended. I've learned the most when I've been offended. I've learned the most from challenging people who disagree with me. And I've learned the most from people who have very different value sets than I do. And so I believe strongly that we shouldn't be looking to move our faith out of the marketplace of politics and marketplace of ideas. We should have a freedom that protects all of them and doesn't crown any one belief in government over another. But that doesn't mean we should be silencing people's beliefs and conveying that as part of their value system and why they choose to be involved in government.
How about this side of the room? Claire, do you see someone? I think we got a nice Colby College representing over there in the sweatshirt.
Should I stand?
That'd be great.
Okay. Hi, my name is Caroline.
Hi, Caroline.
I'm a government major. I'm a junior, and I'm from Florida. And I would love to bring us back to the topic of abortion. It's been a really major topic, especially in the debate.
And in Florida.
And in Florida, yes. You mentioned our 6-week ban earlier, and I would like to point out that we do have Amendment 4 up for voting this election, which does vote to constitute the right to abortion in Florida. I think many others saw Roe v. Wade as a nationwide protection to choose what I and many other people do with their body. It was the right to have an abortion. It was the right not to have an abortion. And in Florida, with our current 6-week ban, I'm very restricted if I were to choose to have an abortion. Whereas here in college in Maine, I'm not subjugated to that same 6-week ban. So my question to you is, how do you reconcile that as an American, my right to my body changes across state lines?
I think you asked me a very specific question. I'll answer and then brought it out. I think that that Roe v. Wade, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg said was created out of whole cloth. There wasn't a constitutional foundation for that. And so I think that when there wasn't an issue that was, I think, directly raised in our Constitution, we reserve that right for the states to decide. I think that what the justices in Dobbs offered was to say, we're returning this to the people to decide. And that didn't mean there can't be federal legislation to set a minimum. It didn't mean that states couldn't decide it differently. It simply meant that what Roe v. Wade said was not supported in the Constitution. And so therefore, we're returning it to the American people. And if that means if Congress established Roe v. Wade, that would be the law of the land too. So it's giving it in many ways back to the people to make that decision. Does that answer specifically about why it's state lines?
I suppose I think an issue that I have with that, thank you, Claire, is that you mentioned that you want this to be a state by state regulated issue, and that you believe.
No, I'm sorry. That was not what I was advocating. I was saying
Okay.
that is what President Trump has advocated,
Right.
which I made a comparison, I think, to where we were in the 1850s.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm sorry if that was the confusion. I hope that settled.
I think,
I'm Wilson Bailey. I'm a sophomore government major from Texas.
Wilson gave me my campus tour. So.
We've been talking about the reactionary right a lot in terms of Trump, but I believe that the reactionary movement, the perverted form of the conservative movement started in the 80s, 90s with like Robert Bork slouching towards Gomorrah, a reaction towards a change in culture that many Americans didn't understand and didn't like. So my question is, like, where did William F. Buckley go and how do we get him back?
Wilson, I wish I knew. I share that, obviously belief that we've lost in many cases the intellectual opinions of where our party is and what we stand for. I go back to 2016. Trump defeated a lot of really talented people in 2016. There were a lot of Republicans who sat out 2012 because they thought they couldn't beat Obama, but they were dying to run in 2016. And that was a very talented field. But I think Trump could see that America was anxious for an outsider, somebody who was entirely different, who would promise to be their vehicle to go change Washington. And I think that's what a lot of people wanted. And I don't view that as necessarily anti-conservative. I think that even Thomas Jefferson said a little revolution now and then is a good thing. So it can be healthy for us to distort it to a degree. And it can be healthy for us to upset the apple cart of Washington, D.C., but that doesn't go as far as basically asking your vice president to ignore his constitutional oath. If we're truly conservative, then we believe in the rule of law as a foundation. And so I believe that there are still voices that have succeeded Buckley, but there's no doubt that right now our party is enamored with Trump. And I think that's because there's still this push right now to throw them all out, as I think we've had in our country before. I think there's a lot of similarities to the Andrew Jackson era, in fact.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about this kind of intellectual future of the Republican Party. The Heritage Foundation's now very well publicized Project 2025 is an 800-page document essentially outlining a future for the Republican Party and the conservative movement. If Republicans are to gain some power in the House, Senate, or even the presidency, what do you think are the logical next steps following an intellectual framework such as Project 2025 or otherwise? What should we be talking about as legislative priorities to kind of put the conservative movement back on track towards kind of finding its soul once again?
I think that Project 2025 is something that Heritage has done in previous times as well, is to say, here's going to be a playbook for a next administration. I think that they allowed it to be something different, and that I think once Democrats picked it up and effectively targeted it and became an albatross for Trump, he distanced himself from it. I think, though, that if there was, let's say, a Trump 2.0, and your question is how could we, kind of resurrect the intellectual conservative part of our party, I think that there were a lot of people around Trump in the first administration who were truly conservative and directed a lot of the policy. I don't think they would be there in the second administration. And so my concern would be, as I mentioned, on things like trade policy. My concern would be on things like Ukraine and some elements of foreign policy. Concern would be basically saying I'm going to use DOJ as a weapon against my political opponents, and I would say as well that from a regulatory perspective, I think that the first Trump administration was very deregulatory. And I'm not so sure a second one would be. I think you'd be far more picking winners and losers to say, which industry has been supportive of me, I'll deregulate, which industry has not, I'm going to continue to regulate or overregulate. And examples would be, in my mind, big tech. It's certainly, something that he's advertised that I'd be regulating more. Pharma industry, and that's one that I think he just used politically as a negative, and so Americans don't like big pharma, so I'll regulate that. So I don't think it would be a consistent policy like we had in the first administration.
Yeah. Okay. I see two people, so right in the middle and then over there.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Carter. I'm from Richmond, Virginia.
Hey, Carter.
I'm a sophomore and I'm a Gov and Global Studies major. Earlier, you talked a lot about Reagan, and I feel like modern Republicans quote Reagan a lot, and they reference the Reagan era as one to be emulated or say he's like the greatest president. However, Reagan often spoke about working across the aisle, and he was relatively open on immigration. So my question is, where has Reaganism failed modern Republicans, or do you think that maybe modern Republicans are failing Reagan?
That's a good question, Carter. I think that if I had to choose between those two, I'd say the latter. I don't think that Reagan failed us. I do think that we've walked away from many of the principles. I'm somebody who grew up in high school during the Reagan years, and it's not in my bio, but one of the first jobs I had was working at Young America's Foundation when they bought the Reagan Ranch and the Reagan property. So college students like you, if you want to learn more, can go out there and learn about Reagan and visit his Western White House. But you're right. I think that there was, not just from a policy perspective, there was also a tonal difference. Reagan was always an optimist. His embrace of immigrants was because he knew his own family had immigrated from Ireland. He believed that giving people the opportunity for freedom is something that we should be offering the globe. And I think that he embodied that sunny optimism in so many ways that our party misses today. And so I think you gave me a binary choice, and I would tell you that I think that it's not Reagan that failed. I think it's our party that's walked away from those Reagan principles.
Should we even be making that comparison anymore? I mean, some people may say the country is just fundamentally different than it was 40 years ago. Demographically, in terms of technology, throwing a line to media. I mean, does
our country is different than it was 250 years ago. Should we tear up the Constitution?
If only somebody taught a class on that.
I would like to believe that many of the principles that Reagan embodied 40 years ago were the same belief and the same principles that our founders had when we established our republic. And so I think they're consistent. I think they're the same answers to the problems that plague our country today. And that's where we should be turning.
Thank you, Mark. I'm Ivan. I'm from New York City. I'm a psychology major. This is my last semester at school.
Congrats.
Thank you. So this summer, I had the opportunity of leading one of our outdoor orientation trips. And that definitely was an awesome experience and taught me a lot about leadership. So I'm kind of going to throw you a softball, but not to compare our very different experiences. But given your experience as chief of staff, what do you think is the most important quality for effective leadership in the executive branch, and how can that be cultivated in future leaders?
Thanks, Ivan. I think that I know you said it's a softball, but I think that our greatest presidents have viewed their job as what I would call a servant leadership. They understand they're serving the American people. They understand they're serving the people that put them there. And this is a cherished system and a cherished body of people. And those who view it as a privilege to serve others in that capacity, in that role, I think have been our most successful leaders. I think those who view it for personal gain or for other opportunities, I think have been less effective. And so, I think that something else that's important in leadership is to establish a culture. And I think that I hope that in the vice president's office, we establish a culture that started with telling everybody who interviewed that our job there was to serve the American people, and in many cases to serve the other part of the West Wing, because Trump was the one who was elected. And we wanted to be supportive of those policies and supportive of the American people. And so I would, so I keep saying the same thing, but I believe that Christian principles of servant leadership are important. And I think that our presidents that have embodied that have been the most successful.
I think we have time for probably a couple more. Nick, do you see? I can't see all
There's
the way
some
out.
hands in the back. There's one.
Go to the back.
Hi, I'm Maya. I'm from Massachusetts, and I'm a sophomore and a government major.
Hey, Maya.
This is also kind of a softball question.
I'm
But
glad y'all think they're all softballs.
so chief of staff for the vice president is like a very prestigious position. And I know you mentioned working on Capitol Hill under Mike Pence, but could you tell us a little bit about your process of how you got to be chief of staff for the vice president?
Sure. I'll try not to make this too long. You know, someone had asked me before the program started this question, so I'll kind of blend these together. I always struggled with questions that I had in interviews of what's your 5-year plan? And I hope that any of you at your age that are struggling with that don't. I have no doubt that God puts in the hearts of some people exactly what they're going to do with their lives. I've never known, and I don't have a 5-year plan to this day. When I went and I had a couple jobs in the political space, I decided I want out of this. And I went back to MBA school down at the University of Virginia. And when I'm applying for admission, I said, if we let you in, what's your 5-year plan? And I made up something that I thought sounded smart at the time, but I didn't know. And 2 years later, every recruiter comes on campus from corporate America, and they're like trying to decide which ones they're going to give a job to. They said, if we give you a job, what's your 5-year plan? And I didn't have an answer then either. And what happened is I decided out of business school, I actually like politics. And I love business school, but I decided I might as well pursue what I like. And I ended up getting a job in the Bush administration, which happened to lead to a job that I parachuted in as K. Hutchison's chief of staff, which those of you who work on Capitol Hill, it was unlikely to be in that position without any experience on the Hill. Because you work your way up to that job, and it's one in the Senate, your offices are determined by the size of your state. So Texas, pretty big state. She was in leadership. We had one of the biggest offices in Washington. And I asked her one day, I said, you know, why'd you ever hire me for this job? She's like, well, Mark, everyone else on Capitol Hill is a lawyer. You got an MBA, which doesn't make any sense at all, but it was why she hired me. And I'm sitting thinking, well, why did I ever go back to MBA school? Because I didn't use it to go into corporate America, but it got me a job as her chief of staff. Fast forward a couple years, she's working on what was called at the time a guest worker program to bring more guest workers into the country in a private sector managed process. You know who her House sponsor was that bill? Young conservative congressman named Mike Pence. I met Mike Pence with a piece of legislation to bring more migrant workers into America, and that led to the Trump administration. And so I served as Mike's chief of staff in leadership, and then I stepped out when he ran for governor in Indiana. I stayed back in D.C. and was working for the nefarious Koch brothers running their political operations. And then in 2016, when Pence was tapped, I joined the ticket, and so that's how I ended up in the White House. But I give you the long story because I believe that for many of you, God has placed on your heart what you want to do. But for those of you who are 19, 20, 21 years old, and you're starting thinking, you know, I'm going to graduate soon, I don't have a plan. My best advice for you is to take a deep breath. You're graduating from an amazing school. You're going to have all sorts of opportunities. And that if you, like me, have faith and believe that there is a sovereign God, then I'd encourage you to try to know him, because I bet he has a plan for you.
And it's mysterious as to how that's going to work out. But if I were sitting and tell you I had a strategy to go to MBA school so I could be chief of staff for K. Billy Hutchison to meet Mike Pence and one day end up working in the White House, that would be a total lie. So my best advice to all of you is try to take a deep breath about what your next 5-year plan is going to look like. Sorry if I'm talking too much like a dad, but I've got 3 kids that are roughly your age.
So I think we, okay, one last question, and then I'm going to take the last question. Professor Jacobs picked you, so go ahead.
Yeah.
So this isn't really the last question.
Oh, no. All right. All right, we got.
Okay, hello, Mr. Short, and my name is Herbert, and I'm a freshman government student at Kobe, and I'm from China. And you mentioned Ronald Reagan's policy to arm people to freedom across the world, and former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has made a famous speech in front of the Nixon Library saying that the CCP does not represent the great Chinese people. But the Capitol Hill announced this week as a China Week, which is discussing a range of legislation, mostly drafted by Republicans like French Hill. Some are targeting like high-ranking CCP officials, while others are more generalized, like economic, and involving restricting cultural and educational exchanges between China and the US. And based on that, can you break down like the intricacies, like how does the Trump administration China policy works, and what do you think the GOP's China policy should be? How are you planning to separate countering the Chinese government from one hand and avoid from collateral damage to Chinese citizens in the United States and also racism against Chinese and Asian American? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad you're here, and I hope that your experience at Colby College exposes you to a lot. I believe that China is our biggest adversary today. I believe that if you go back to what I think many Republicans advocated in the George H.W. Bush era, was to say, if we can only trade with China, it's going to lead to all sorts of social reforms. And I think what you've seen is that there's been enormous repression of the Uyghurs in China. There's been enormous repression of people of faith in China. China has stated pretty emphatically its desire to dominate the Pacific. And I think that if you look at what they're investing in their military right now, it dwarfs what Russia, Iran, others are doing. And so I think on the one hand, we have to remain open to exchange of students to experience what America has to offer. But we can't be blind as well to, I think, that the threat that China poses to the free world. And I think it's important that our leaders speak candidly about that and not try to mix words on that.
I'm going to turn it to Allison to wrap us up.
So, yes, I just want to thank you so much for this. I know you're on television all the time, so you know if I say you have a 30-second answer, you know what to do with that. Last question of the night. Incredible turnout, incredible students. We're in a very tense political system right now with the election. What's your advice to them moving forward over the next, until we get to the end of November? What should they be doing?
Well, thanks, Allison. And I think that, when I get the 30-second wrap, I usually know that means I can just take all 30 seconds and no one else will get a chance to speak. So, my encouragement to you all is to be involved. I think that it's great that so many of you turned out, and I appreciate that. I know that you probably have a lot of other things to do, and I don't know which weeknight is the party night at Colby College. So I'm grateful for you taking the time to even show up. But I think it's easy when you're a college student, and I know when I was a college student, I had a lot of other priorities than worrying about politics. But the people that we choose to represent us, we get the government we deserve. And we talk about things we want to do to change it. That only happens with your involvement. And there's a lot of ways to be involved. Some of you will be more activists than others activists. But it's your country, it's your future. And to at least be knowledgeable about what the issues are and what it is that I think people are fighting for is important. And I would tell you as well that, as I said to Aubrey's first question, it's important to have people of character who are willing to step forward and serve our country in all kinds of different ways. It's an amazing country. And to the other question about, ending up in the White House was an incredibly chaotic time. It was an incredibly, I think, unusual White House. I can't sit here and tell you there wasn't a day that I drove through the white gates through Secret Service that I wasn't really excited to feel like I get a chance to serve the American people today in one of the most amazing buildings in the world. And so, yeah, that doesn't mean it's always going to be easy. It doesn't mean it's always going to be fun, but I think it's worth it for all of us to decide that the freedoms we enjoy in this country are so unique relative to the rest of the world, and it's worth your engagement and involvement. Whether you're right or left, it's more important that you actually stay involved, and particularly people who have a moral clarity as to why they're wanting to fight for the things they want to fight for. So I thank you for being here tonight. It's been a lot of fun for me, and I hope you stay involved.
Well, Marc, thank you so much for joining us. If you could please join me in giving some appreciation tonight.
Thank you.